The bus rattled and swayed, its aging frame protesting against the city's potholed streets. The groan of the engine, a mechanical lament, mingled with the low hum of conversation and the rustle of newspapers, the everyday soundtrack of a city in motion. Amongst the mix of weary commuters and day trippers sat Lily, a bright spark of 8 years old amidst the muted tones of adult life. Her braids, tied with vibrant red ribbons that danced with every bump in the road, framed a face alight with innocent wonder. Clutching her brightly colored school bag to her chest, her small legs swinging freely above the worn vinyl seat, she gazed out the window, her eyes wide and enchanted by the fleeting cityscape, a world of brick buildings, bustling storefronts, and the gray expanse of a winter sky. Beside her, a man slumped precariously in his seat, his face flushed and mottled, his breathing ragged and heavy with the cloying fumes of stale alcohol. The air around him seemed to thicken, weighed down by his sour, unsteady presence. He swayed rhythmically, muttering a stream of incoherent words under his breath, a low, unsettling growl of discontent. His proximity cast a palpable unease over the nearby passengers, a ripple of discomfort spreading through the bus. But Lily, lost in her own world of childish fascination, seemed oblivious. Her attention was completely absorbed by the ever-shifting tableau unfolding beyond the window pane. At the back of the bus, in the less desirable seats near the rumbling engine, sat a man who seemed carved from granite, John Carter, his broad shoulders strained against the confines of the narrow seat, his muscular frame honed by years of rigorous training. He radiated an aura of quiet strength, of contained power. His gaze, sharp and observant, moved slowly, deliberately, across the faces of his fellow passengers, a habit ingrained by years of vigilance, years of assessing threats, years of protecting the vulnerable. A retired Navy SEAL, newly returned from a decade spent in the dust and chaos of foreign deployments, John sought the elusive promise of peace in the mundane rhythm of civilian life. He had chosen the bus today, a conscious decision to immerse himself in the ordinary, to blend into the anonymous crowd, to shed the weight of his past. But some instincts, once forged in the crucible of combat, never truly rested. His keen senses, honed to a razor's edge by years of life-and-death situations, remained perpetually alert, scanning, assessing, analyzing. He noted the subtle shifts in body language, the fleeting micro-expressions that betrayed hidden emotions, the almost imperceptible changes in the air that spoke of rising tension, of potential conflict simmering beneath the surface of everyday normalcy. The atmosphere on the bus, previously a low murmur of mundane sounds, shifted abruptly. The air tightened with an almost palpable tension. The man beside Lily, his slurred words growing louder, more aggressive, began to speak, his voice now laced with a raw, undisguised disdain. His bloodshot eyes narrowed, focusing with unsettling intensity on the small, innocent figure beside him. Other passengers, their initial unease escalating to palpable apprehension, exchanged worried glances, their eyes darting nervously toward the unfolding scene. But they remained silent, frozen in a collective inertia, unwilling to provoke the escalating situation, hesitant to draw the unpredictable wrath of the drunken man upon themselves. Lily's innocent calm, her oblivious serenity, seemed to further agitate the man, fueling his incoherent rage, twisting his drunken mutterings into a darker, more menacing tirade. "You people," he spat, the words slurring together, thick with venom. His voice rose above the steady hum of the bus engine. "You people think you own everything?" Lily, startled by the sudden eruption of anger, turned to him, her brow furrowed in confusion, her small face etched with a dawning fear. Her wide, innocent eyes, the color of warm honey, questioned his irrational anger, seeking understanding in the chaotic storm of his drunken rage. Before anyone could react, before a single passenger could find their voice, the man's fist, thick and clumsy, flew through the air with shocking speed. A blur of motion culminated in a sickening thud as it landed a sharp, brutal blow against Lily's delicate cheek. The bus fell into a stunned, profound silence. The air suddenly thick and heavy. The collective breath of the passengers held captive in their chests. Passengers froze, their bodies rigid with disbelief, their minds struggling to process the sudden, unprovoked act of violence that had shattered the mundane routine of their bus ride. But not John. For John, time seemed to distort, to compress, to sharpen into an agonizingly clear focus. The instant he saw the man's hand move, the microsecond before impact, his years of military training, the ingrained reflexes honed by countless life-or-death scenarios, kicked in with brutal efficiency. In a heartbeat, in a single, fluid motion, he was out of his seat. His towering presence, his imposing physicality, now cast a long, ominous shadow over the slumped, drunken figure of the attacker. John's voice, low and authoritative, cutting through the shocked silence like a honed blade, sliced through the suffocating tension, demanding attention, commanding compliance. "You've made a mistake," he stated, his voice calm, measured, yet carrying an undeniable undercurrent of steel, of barely contained force. "A serious mistake, and you're going to regret it." The bus, every passenger on board, seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation, with a mixture of fear and a nascent, flickering hope. John loomed over the man. His physical presence radiated an almost palpable threat. His gaze was unwavering, his posture radiating an unspoken promise of swift, decisive action. Lily, her small hand instinctively rising to clutch her throbbing cheek, let out a soft, heart-wrenching whimper, a sound of pure, unadulterated fear that pierced through the stunned silence. A sound that resonated deep within John's soul, igniting a protective instinct he hadn't known he still possessed. John crouched briefly, his movements surprisingly gentle despite his imposing size. His hand, calloused and strong, hovered near Lily's face, his touch feather-light, as he checked for injury. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" he asked. His deep voice, usually reserved and taciturn, now carried a surprising warmth, a gentle tenderness that belied his hardened exterior. She nodded hesitantly, her small head bobbing almost imperceptibly, too shocked, too frightened, too overwhelmed to form coherent words. Her wide, tear-filled eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, betrayed the depth of her fear, the fragility of her shattered innocence. John's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing visibly in his cheek. His gaze hardened, his expression turned steely unforgiving, as his attention shifted back to the man who had dared to strike her, who had shattered the fragile piece of their shared space with his violent, unprovoked act of aggression. The drunkard, now fully, belatedly, aware of the towering, menacing figure looming over him, slurred out a defensive, almost pathetic justification, his bravado already crumbling under the weight of John's unwavering gaze. She deserved it," he stammered, his words thick and incoherent, holding his hands up defensively, a feeble, belated attempt at self-preservation. Sitting there like she owns the place, his words, dripping with venom, laced with the insidious poison of ingrained prejudice, ignited a spark, a cold, incandescent flame of righteous anger in John's usually placid, usually controlled, steely blue eyes. Slowly, methodically, with a deliberate, almost unnerving calm, John straightened to his full height, his imposing frame now fully extended, his shadow falling over the cowering figure of the drunk man, his hands, previously relaxed, now clenched into tight, unforgiving fists by his sides, his knuckles white with barely suppressed fury. At the front of the bus, a woman, her voice sharp with outrage, her face flushed with indignation, shouted across the hushed space, breaking the tense silence. "That man," she exclaimed, her voice ringing with righteous anger, pointing an accusatory finger toward the drunkard slumped in his seat. "That man hit the little girl." Another voice, younger, more hesitant yet equally outraged, chimed in from the middle of the bus. "Someone call the police." Her words, simple, direct, yet imbued with a quiet, powerful sense of collective action, sent a visible ripple of relief through the passengers. A nascent surge of anger spread across the bus, growing into a shared demand for justice. John turned briefly to the bus driver, his tone calm and authoritative, yet devoid of aggression. His gaze was direct, commanding respect. "Call the police," he instructed, his voice clear, concise, unambiguous. This man assaulted a child. The driver, his initial irritation dissolving into a dawning understanding of the gravity of the situation, nodded quickly. His expression turned serious as he pulled out his phone with a practiced efficiency, his fingers dialing 911 with the speed of someone accustomed to handling urban emergencies. The drunkard, now belatedly and fully realizing the gravity of his rapidly deteriorating situation, the collective condemnation of his fellow passengers, the undeniable authority of the towering figure standing guard over him, began to squirm in his seat. His earlier bravado evaporated completely, his drunken arrogance dissolving into a pathetic puddle of fear and self-pity. "Wait, wait," he stammered, his words slurred, his voice weak and pleading. He held his hands up defensively, a futile gesture of surrender. "This is all a misunderstanding," he whimpered, his voice barely audible. His eyes darted nervously around the bus, searching for escape, for sympathy, but finding only cold condemnation in the faces of his fellow passengers. John's eyes narrowed, his gaze intensifying, his voice dropping to a low growl, a sound that resonated with barely contained fury. "You don't misunderstand," he stated, each word clipped precise, laced with contempt, punching a defenseless child. As the bus remained stationary, parked awkwardly on the side of the road, the passengers, emboldened by John's unwavering stance, his quiet act of defiance, began to subtly, almost unconsciously, surround the drunk man. They formed an impromptu barrier, a silent human wall, ensuring his confinement, preventing any possibility of escape. Some, their phones still recording, documented the unfolding scene, capturing the raw, unscripted drama for the ever-watchful eyes of the digital world. Others, their initial fear now replaced by a surge of protective empathy, offered quiet comfort to Lily. She remained visibly shaken, still clutching her bruised cheek, her small body trembling with residual fear. A kind elderly woman, her face etched with concern, gently handed Lily a tissue, whispering soothing words. Her voice was soft, reassuring, a balm against the lingering sting of violence. "It's going to be okay, dear," she murmured, patting Lily's small hand with a gentle, comforting touch. John knelt beside the little girl again, his expression softening. His voice, now gentle and reassuring, was a stark contrast to the steely authority he had just displayed. "Lily," he asked quietly, his voice intimate, "do you have someone waiting for you? At home?" She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Her voice was barely above a whisper, her gaze fixed on her lap, still too overwhelmed to meet his eyes directly. "My mom," she murmured, the single word heavy with unspoken longing, with a fragile hope for safety, for comfort, for the familiar embrace of parental love. The drunk man, his desperation escalating, his fear now palpable, attempted to push past the growing crowd of passengers surrounding him. He mumbled incoherently about leaving, about going home, about escaping the rapidly closing net of consequences. But John's hand shot out, swift, firm, unyielding, intercepting his feeble attempt at escape. His grip was like steel on the man's arm, preventing any further movement. "You're not going anywhere," John stated, his voice low, resolute, utterly devoid of negotiation, "until the police get here." The man's face, already flushed with alcohol, turned ashen. His complexion paled visibly as he fully, finally, realized the gravity of his situation, the inescapable reality of the consequences he was about to face. His bravado, his drunken arrogance, his fleeting sense of false power had completely melted away, replaced by raw, naked fear, a desperate, futile longing for escape. The bus, once a mundane vehicle of public transportation, had become, in that charged, unforgettable moment, a bubble of collective justice, a microcosm of community responsibility. It was a testament to the inherent human impulse to protect the vulnerable, to stand against injustice, to ensure that even in the face of random violence, accountability, and ultimately some measure of redemption would prevail. The distant, faint wail of sirens, initially almost imperceptible, grew steadily louder, more insistent. The sharp sound sliced through the hushed murmur of the passengers, announcing the imminent arrival of law enforcement, the tangible promise of intervention, the dawning of justice for Lily. The bus driver, his phone now tucked away, stood at the open doorway, waving down the approaching police cruiser. Its flashing blue and red lights painted the interior of the bus in a pulsating, urgent glow. Inside, the tension remained palpable. The air was still thick with unspoken emotion as all eyes, every gaze on board, stayed fixed on the drunk man, slumped in his seat, now sweating profusely. His earlier bravado was completely extinguished, his muttered protests alternating between weak, unconvincing denials and half-hearted, utterly insincere apologies. John stood firm, a silent sentinel. His imposing figure blocked any path of escape, his calm, unwavering demeanor only heightening the gravity of the moment. It emphasized the stark contrast between his quiet strength and the man's pathetic, self-inflicted downfall. Lily sat still, small and vulnerable, her hands cradling her injured cheek. The redness of the impact was still starkly visible against her delicate skin. Several passengers, their initial fear now replaced by a wave of protective empathy, offered her comforting smiles, whispered words of encouragement, small gestures of human solidarity. A middle-aged woman, her eyes filled with compassion, gently handed Lily a juice box, a small offering of comfort, a simple act of kindness in the aftermath of violence. An older man, his voice gruff but kind, his eyes filled with paternal warmth, said quietly, his words meant only for Lily's ears, "You're so brave, little one." Lily managed a small, almost shy nod, her grip on the juice box tightening. Her small body still trembled slightly, her eyes still wide with residual fear. John crouched beside her again, his voice steady, reassuring, a soothing balm against the lingering trauma of the assault. "You're safe now, Lily," he said gently, his gaze unwavering, his presence a tangible shield against the lingering shadow of fear. "No one," he promised, his voice firm, resolute, "no one is going to hurt you again." She looked up at him then, her small face upturned, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes, still shimmering with unshed tears, were now filled with a mixture of dawning trust, fragile hope, and an undeniable, almost childlike gratitude. The bus doors hissed open, releasing a rush of cold night air. Two uniformed police officers, their expressions professional, their movements purposeful, stepped inside. Their presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the contained space. Their arrival signaling the official intervention of law enforcement, the tangible promise of justice finally arriving. His bravado extinguished, a ripple of audible relief, a collective sigh of release, swept through the passengers. Several people cheered quietly, their initial fear giving way to a palpable sense of justice served, of collective vindication, of shared relief. The officer remaining on the bus turned to John, his expression now carrying a hint of genuine appreciation, a silent acknowledgement of the Navy SEAL's decisive intervention. John extended his hand, his grip firm, professional. "John Carter," he said simply, offering his name, his identity, without fanfare or self-aggrandizement. "I intervened when he hit the girl." The officer nodded appreciatively, his gaze steady, respectful. "We'll need your statement, Mr. Carter," he said, his tone now official, procedural. "And the girl's mother should be contacted." John turned then, his attention shifting back to Lily. Crouching down to her level again, his voice was gentle, reassuring. "Lily," he asked softly, his gaze meeting hers, his presence a tangible source of comfort, "do you know your mom's phone number?" She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and recited it slowly, her voice still trembling slightly, each digit a fragile offering of trust. John relayed the number to the officer, who promptly, efficiently, made the call. His voice was calm and reassuring as he spoke to Lily's mother, informing her of the incident, assuring her of her daughter's safety, and requesting her immediate presence at the scene. The passengers, their initial shock now receding, began to settle back into their seats. The hushed chatter shifted, evolving into a murmur of praise for John's heroic actions and a shared wave of sympathy for Lily, the innocent victim of unprovoked violence. John, ever watchful, ever vigilant, remained by Lily's side. His protective instincts were still on high alert, his quiet presence a tangible shield against any further threat, any lingering fear. Outside, the flashing blue and red lights of the police car illuminated the night, casting long, dancing shadows across the pavement, signaling an end to the immediate ordeal and the dawning of justice, however imperfect, for Lily. The bus had gone quiet again, the earlier tension now replaced by a heavy, almost oppressive, emotional weight. A shared acknowledgement of the fragility of safety, the ever-present threat of random violence, and the enduring power of human compassion in the face of darkness. Lily sat still, her small body slumped with exhaustion, holding a cold bottle of water someone had given her to soothe her bruised cheek. The condensation beaded on the plastic, mirroring the tears that still glistened in her eyes. John remained by her side, his presence unwavering, a silent guardian, a steadfast protector, a beacon of quiet strength amidst the lingering shadows of fear. Outside, in the back of the police car, the drunk man sat slumped and defeated, his head hanging low, his bravado completely extinguished. The harsh reality of his actions, the weight of their inevitable consequences, was seemingly, finally, beginning to sink in. The officer who had made the call to Lily's mother returned, stepping back onto the bus with a reassuring nod, his expression calm and professional, yet conveying a subtle sense of shared relief. "She's on her way," he said, his voice calm, reassuring. "She's very concerned." Minutes later, a car screeched to a halt near the bus, its tires protesting against the sudden stop. A woman in her early 30s, her face etched with a mixture of fear, anxiety, and raw maternal urgency, rushed toward the vehicle. Her movements were frantic, her heart pounding in her chest. "Lily!" she called out, her voice cracking with emotion, a desperate plea, a raw outpouring of maternal terror. She ran toward the open doors of the bus, her gaze searching desperately for her daughter, her breath catching in her throat. John stood and stepped aside, melting back into the shadows, giving the woman space, giving her the precious privacy of a mother's reunion with her child. Lily, hearing the familiar sound of her mother's voice, seeing her mother's frantic, searching gaze, leapt from her seat. Her small body was propelled forward by a surge of pure, unadulterated relief, launching herself into her mother's arms. Tears streamed down her face as she finally, irrevocably, let go of the accumulated tension, the bottled-up fear, the overwhelming trauma of the assault. "Mommy," she sobbed, her voice breaking as she buried her face in her mother's shoulder, seeking the familiar comfort, the unwavering safety, the unconditional love of her mother's embrace. Lily's mother, Angela, a woman who radiated quiet strength, resilience, and determination, held her daughter tightly. Her arms wrapped protectively around Lily's small frame as she stroked her hair, whispering words of comfort, reassurance, and love. Her sharp, intelligent eyes quickly took in the scene, assessing the situation, registering John's quiet presence, the uniformed officer, the lingering tension in the air. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice trembling yet firm, laced with a potent mixture of maternal rage and raw, protective concern. Her gaze fixed on the officer, demanding answers, demanding accountability, demanding justice for her child. John stepped forward then, emerging from the shadows. His tone was respectful yet firm, his presence a calming anchor in the swirling chaos of emotion. "A drunk man assaulted her," he explained concisely, his voice measured, professional. devoid of any self-aggrandizement. He's in custody now, and the police are handling it. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something akin to admiration, of genuine respect, crossing his usually impassive features. Then he added, his voice softening slightly, his gaze shifting to Lily, still clinging to her mother. She was incredibly brave. Angela's eyes softened, her initial fear and rage giving way to a wave of profound gratitude. She turned to John, her gaze meeting his, her expression conveying a depth of emotion that transcended spoken words. "Thank you," she said sincerely, her voice thick with emotion, her heart overflowing with an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude. "Thank you for being there. For her." John nodded, his gaze briefly meeting hers, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a shared understanding of the unspoken depths of human compassion, before returning to Lily. She still clung to her mother, her small body trembling, as if letting go, even for a moment, would somehow conjure back the lingering shadow of danger. The officer stepped in gently, his voice professional, procedural, explaining the process of filing charges, outlining the legal steps that would follow, detailing the need for a formal statement from Angela, from Lily, from John. Angela listened intently, nodding slowly, deliberately, absorbing the information. Her composure returned, her initial panic now replaced by a steely resolve, a fierce determination to ensure justice was served, to protect her daughter, to shield her from any further harm. As the bus began to empty, passengers, now replaced by a wave of shared humanity, stopped to offer Angela and Lily words of support, encouragement, and solidarity. Some praised John effusively for his heroic actions, their voices filled with admiration, with gratitude, with a sense of vicarious relief. Others, their faces etched with anger and disgust, expressed their outrage at the drunk man's senseless, brutal behavior. Their voices rose in collective condemnation of prejudice, of violence, of injustice. John, ever humble, ever self-effacing, deflected the attention, deliberately shifting the focus back to Lily, ensuring her comfort, prioritizing her well-being above all else. "She's strong," he said quietly to Angela, his voice barely audible amidst the hushed murmur of the dispersing crowd, his gaze fixed on Lily, still nestled in her mother's arms. "Stronger than she should have to be." Angela's eyes glistened with unshed tears, a mixture of sorrow and fierce maternal pride, as she nodded slowly, her voice thick with emotion. "She gets it from her mother," she replied, managing a bittersweet smile, a fragile acknowledgement of her own quiet strength, her own unwavering resilience. "You saved my daughter," Angela continued, her voice thick with emotion, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I want to thank you." Properly. John hesitated for a moment, his gaze softening, a flicker of something akin to vulnerability, of unexpected emotion, crossed his usually impassive features before he responded. His voice was quiet, understated, utterly devoid of self-aggrandizement. "John Carter," he said simply, offering his name, his identity, without fanfare, without expectation of reward, without any desire for recognition. "And there's no need for thanks, Angela," he added, his voice carrying a quiet conviction, a simple, undeniable truth. "Anyone," he stated, his gaze unwavering, his voice resonating with a profound sense of human solidarity, "anyone would have done the same." Angela shook her head slowly, deliberately, her gaze fixed on John, her expression conveying a depth of emotion that words could not adequately capture. "Not everyone," she said, her voice tinged with a profound sadness, a quiet acknowledgement of the all-too-common absence of human compassion in the face of suffering, of injustice, of violence. "Not everyone, John," she repeated, her voice now carrying a quiet conviction, a deep, visceral understanding of the rarity, the preciousness, the transformative power of genuine human kindness. "What you did," she continued, her voice imbued with heartfelt gratitude, took courage. "You didn't just protect her, John. You stood up for her. When no one else did, John's expression softened slightly, a subtle shift in his usually stoic demeanor, but he remained steadfastly, stubbornly humble, deflecting the praise, minimizing his own extraordinary act of courage. "I just did what was right," he replied simply. His voice was quiet, understated, devoid of any self-congratulation. His words carried the quiet weight of a deeply held moral compass, a profound sense of personal responsibility. "Lily," he added, his gaze softening further, his voice now infused with quiet compassion, "Lily didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does." His words, simple, direct, yet profoundly resonant, carried the unspoken weight of someone who had seen too much injustice in the world, too much senseless violence, too much unnecessary suffering. His voice was a quiet testament to his enduring commitment to protect the vulnerable, to stand against the tide of human cruelty, to fight for justice, however small, however fleeting, wherever he found it. As the police car pulled away, its taillights fading into the night, taking the drunk man away to face the consequences of his actions, Lily reached out a small, hesitant hand toward John. Her gaze upturned, her eyes now clear, trusting, devoid of the earlier fear. "Thank you, Mr. John," she said softly, her voice still a little shaky but now filled with genuine, heartfelt sincerity, a child's pure, unadulterated gratitude. Her small hand slipped into his, her fingers intertwining with his callous, strong ones. And for the first time that evening, a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a fragile flicker of warmth, broke across John's usually serious face, illuminating his features with an unexpected gentleness. "You're welcome, Lily," he said gently, his voice infused with quiet tenderness, a fatherly warmth he hadn't consciously known he possessed. "You're a brave little girl, Lily," he added, his gaze unwavering, his voice carrying quiet conviction, a message meant not just for Lily but for himself, for the world, for anyone who might be listening. "Don't ever forget that." Angela's car was parked nearby, a small, practical sedan, a symbol of her quiet strength, her everyday resilience. As she led Lily toward it, her arm wrapped protectively around her daughter's small shoulders, she turned back one last time. Her gaze met John's, her expression conveying a depth of gratitude that words could not fully express. "If you ever need anything, John," she said, her voice soft, sincere, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her heart overflowing with an emotion she couldn't yet name, "you'll always have our gratitude." John nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but didn't respond verbally. His gaze remained fixed on Angela and Lily, his presence a silent promise, a quiet commitment. As they drove away, their taillights fading into the urban night, John stood silently by the side of the road. The weight of the evening settled over him, a complex mixture of exhaustion, relief, and quiet, profound satisfaction. He had spent years protecting others in distant war zones, facing down nameless enemies in foreign lands. But moments like this, unexpected encounters in the mundane reality of everyday life, reminded him with visceral force why he had chosen that path, why he had dedicated his life to service, to protection, to standing against injustice in any form, wherever he found it. The bus driver approached him then, breaking the lingering silence. His voice was gruff yet kind, his hand clapping John firmly on the shoulder, a gesture of masculine camaraderie, of shared human understanding. "You've got a good heart, mister," he said, his voice rough yet sincere, his gaze meeting John's, a silent acknowledgement of shared humanity passing between them. "Not everyone," the driver continued, shaking his head slowly, deliberately. "Not everyone would have done what you did tonight." John shrugged, his gaze still fixed on the fading taillights of Angela's car, his expression thoughtful, introspective. His voice was quiet, understated, utterly devoid of self-congratulation. "Sometimes," he said simply, his voice barely audible above the city's hum, "sometimes doing the right thing is all that matters." With that quiet, profound statement, he turned and stepped off the curb, melting back into the anonymity of the city night. His tall, solitary figure disappeared into the shadows, a quiet hero, a silent guardian, who expected nothing in return, who sought no recognition, who simply, resolutely, did what was right. The night was quiet, the city's relentless energy subtly muted, as John walked the dimly lit streets. His footsteps were steady and deliberate, his movements as precise and economical as always. His thoughts drifted back to Lily's tear-streaked face, the raw, unadulterated fear in her wide, innocent eyes, the quiet, heartfelt gratitude of her mother, Angela. It wasn't the first time he'd stepped in to protect someone. It wasn't the first time he'd instinctively intervened to defend the vulnerable against the predatory. But this encounter, this seemingly random act of violence on an ordinary city bus, felt different. John had spent years on distant battlefields, facing down clearly defined enemies in foreign lands, fighting for abstract ideals, for distant notions of freedom and democracy. But the war against injustice at home, the quiet, insidious battles fought in the everyday spaces of his own city, always seemed far more personal, far more intimate, far more urgent. John's apartment, small, modest, sparsely furnished, tucked away in a quiet, almost forgotten corner of the city, offered a stark contrast to the chaos